Hi, economists. This is Mr. Beckstrom, and I've got a little bit more econ content for you today. One of the very last concepts to be covered in AP Microeconomics, market failures, and in particular today, the market failure of a inequitable distribution of wealth. Notice that I said inequitable distribution of wealth, not unequal distribution of wealth. The goal of any free market economy is not a totally equal distribution of wealth. Obviously, people can become rich in a free market economy. Inequitable, meaning some people have vastly more than they need. You see the Bill Gates as an example there, but just think of any kind of rich person, any billionaire spending $1 billion. Well, $1 billion is vastly more than you need to live well. And we're going to take a look today at some of the behavior that comes along with people being very, very wealthy, and why the idea that allowing some to become vastly wealthy will create economic growth for all by having those folks reinvest into the economy and create jobs is a little bit misguided. So, on we go. First, let's take a look at savings rates. What we have here is data that divides the population of, say, the United States in this case, into quintiles. You can use this quintile approach when looking at any group or income levels for any group. Also, you'll notice today that in this video, income and wealth are sometimes treated interchangeably. Wealth is what we're more concerned with. Income is the data that we often have and the data that's easiest to measure. So sometimes we're kind of left wanting for that more accurate wealth data, and we'll substitute an income as kind of a less robust measure of wealth. Anyhow, so you can see the bottom 40%, so a quintile would be 20% of the population. If you take the person with the least amount of money, the most like negative debt, and line them up, and the person with the most amount of money in the group at the other end, and divide each, kind of say there's 100 people, there's 20, 20, 20, 20. So the bottom 40 people, the bottom 40% here are saving almost nothing. And the savings rate goes up as we look at the more and more wealthy quintiles. The top 5% and then the top 1% are subsets of quintile 5, and you can see those broken out there. A lot of that savings rate of quintile 5 is obviously powered by that top 1% of income earners, and they're over 50% savings rate from the early 2000s. So why is unequal distribution, or inequitable, I should say, distribution of wealth a market failure? Well, first let's define saving. So when we're talking about saving, the kind of common understanding of saving is putting money into the bank for a rainy day or kind of emergency fund, what have you, or saving up to buy something. You want to buy a new car or house or just a pair of clothes or whatever you might be saving for. You can also think of saving as investing in a business, either directly investing in a business or investing in a business in the secondhand market through the stock market. So investing is good, right? If we're investing in businesses, we're growing the economy, we're creating jobs, we're putting money in people's pockets, and the circular flow is pumping. People are spending, one person's spending is another person's income, and the economy is feeling strong. But that's not always the case. Investment in physical capital has, since the early days of the Industrial Revolution, been outpacing investment in human capital. And when individuals are allowed to kind of maximize their wealth, a lot of that wealth maximization has come through investment in physical capital. Investment in human capital to match that growth and investment in physical capital is typically left in the hands of the individual worker. Cutting taxes on wealthy individuals or high income earners, and paying for those tax cuts by cuts to social services, which harm the development of human capital in underserved communities in the United States, for example, is bad for the economy long term. It undercuts the investment in human capital, and we're left with a situation where the wealth continues to accrue to the few at the top because of their access to investment, their access to, with their own wealth, developing their own human capital. So what we want is a balance, okay? We don't want communism. We don't want plutocracy. We want something in the middle. We want an equitable distribution of wealth. We don't need an even distribution of wealth. We definitely don't want, the very few people owning everything. So in this more equal, more balanced world, a kind of compromise between the two ideological extremes. We need human capital, investment in human capital, to keep up with investment in physical capital. The very wealthy are taking care of investments in physical capital. The role for the government here would be to help maintain the investment, the long-term investment in human capital for the economy to continue to grow and advance, and people to have the skills that they need to think critically, but also to kind of invent new tools and all of that kind of thing. Investing internationally doesn't help grow the domestic economy, as you see there. When very, very wealthy people have a lot of money to invest, you maybe say, like, you know, playing with money that you don't necessarily need. Well, what if I lost this, you know, $100 million? Oh, well, you know, that would hurt, but it wouldn't bankrupt me. So in that situation, people tend to look for high return investments. I have my play money, I can make a high risk move with this, and maybe I'll hit the jackpot and turn that $100 million into $10 billion, or maybe I'll lose it all. So the risky behavior of people investing when they don't care about losing their investment, or I shouldn't say don't care, but when losing that investment isn't a catastrophic loss, can lead to things developing like the credit default swap scheme of 2007 that brought down the global economy and the Great Recession and so on and so forth. Going back in history, we can also see very unequal wealth distribution contributing to the downfall of many societies. Think ancient Rome here as an example. So if you take the money flow, let's say you have money flowing in and around the circular flow, but instead of flowing from firms through factor markets back into households, if the savings rate increases, it siphons money out of the circular flow. Remember, the circular flow is the beating heart of the economy. One person's spending is another person's income. When people have money coming in, they're more stable, they're buying more things, they're generating more economic activity, they are able to contribute in a way that when you're just struggling to get by, living hand to mouth, it's harder to do. So just like a negative feedback cycle can happen with the circular flow, positive feedback cycle can happen, but when excess saving is siphoning blood out of this economic heart of the economy, we're experiencing inefficiency. So a market failure. What I want to show you next is a little bit of a correlation data point between wealth inequality and sustained periods of economic growth. What this chart is showing us is that an unequal income distribution has a larger effect than these other political institutions, trade openness, exchange rate. The graph on the next page will make this a little bit more clear. But as we see income distribution getting less equal, we typically observe shorter periods of economic expansion. That is, less time in between dips in the economy. And this trend line that you can see through those data points pointing down, the larger the inequality gets on the x-axis of this particular chart, the shorter the growth period becomes. You can see the source down there. There's some pernicious effects of wealth inequality across the board that I'll kind of summarize here. In very unequal or inequitable wealth distribution situations, we typically get a less than optimal quantity of public goods, lower levels of self-reported happiness, shorter periods of economic growth, as I just covered, lower life expectancy. You know, the free market isn't necessarily supposed to take care of everyone's happiness and make sure everyone lives a long time. But I think that those are all things that everyone wants in their life. And if we can have a more equitable distribution of wealth and people can be happier and live longer, that's going to be a win. So next up, let's talk about measuring. And my face is kind of in front of the M there. So when we measure wealth distribution, we're going to take a look at two measures here. So I have a graph and a number. This is just another explanation of the quintile piece that I did earlier. Slide, I guess, is kind of out of order. So if we took this data right here, this is just kind of made up data. If the poorest 20% had 5% of the wealth, The next 20%, quintile 2 has 10% of the wealth, and quintile 3 has 15% of the wealth, and so on and so on. We can chart a graph on this thing called the Lorenz curve that looks like this. The diagonal line across the middle is the line of perfect equality. So if 20% of the people, the bottom 20% of the people controlled 20% of the wealth, the bottom 40% of the people, the bottom 60% of the people controlled 60% of the wealth, that would mean essentially in the previous numerical example that each person out of these 100 people has exactly $1. But as we can see here, if in this less equal distribution, each person of the poorest 20 only has 25 cents. Then we get data points that look like this. Okay. Yeah, the little dotted lines don't hit exactly on the axis. Sorry about that. We get what's called the Lorenz curve, and it kind of looks like a banana, so we'll color it in like a banana. There's a little banana graphic. Thank you, Mr. Clifford. The size of the banana shows the degree of wealth inequality. The bigger the banana, the more unequal the wealth. So for example, if the top quintile controlled more than 45% of the wealth, this point right here that I'm pointing to with my cursor would be a little bit lower, and we'd see a thicker banana swiping through this Lorenz curve. If wealth were redistributed, then we would see the banana shrink. The Gini coefficient, though, is it's a data representation of the Lorenz curve that fits more in a spreadsheet and is a lot more applicable to economics. So first we start with the graphical representation of inequality. Now let's look at the a little bit easier to use measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient is kind of can mirror the Lorenz curve. So there's the Lorenz curve there. You see area A and area B. You're doing a little calculus, so you can figure out the Gini coefficient. Or you can just take area A divided by the total area, and you'll get a number that's between 0 and 1. 0 being perfect equality, 1 being perfect inequality. Perfect inequality would be no one has anything except the one person who controls everything, kind of like an authoritarian dictatorship. And this is a distribution of Gini coefficient from 2009, so a little old. Maybe this needs an update. Anyhow, so we can see vastly different distributions of wealth in different places throughout the globe. The United States, as we can see, is kind of sitting in the red level, which is not the best, but not the worst. Again, not that I'm necessarily saying a kind of normative economic statement here, but a too unequal distribution of wealth can lead to the market failures that we presented earlier. So what can we do about it? Thomas Piketty says distribution of knowledge, making a more level playing field, and making sure, say, that like workers know what their true worth is to their bosses and so on and so forth can help a lot in the distribution of wealth. But what most people probably think of is taxes. Dun, dun, dun. So just a couple of minutes to get through taxes here. Everyone knows what taxes are. What do taxes do? They finance public goods. They can influence economic behavior. And in this case, they can redistribute wealth. There's three types of taxes. A progressive tax, which takes a larger percent of income from higher income groups. A flat tax or proportional tax, which takes the same percent of income from all income groups. And a regressive tax, which takes a larger percent of income from lower income groups. The prime example of a progressive tax in American society is the United States income tax, in which you pay more for every additional chunk of money that you earn. Just a side note here, bumping up into a higher tax bracket doesn't mean you pay more taxes. It means that a higher percentage is taken out of that next chunk of money. So me and Bill Gates both pay the same amount of tax on the first $120,000 of our annual income. Bill Gates makes that, in probably the first couple of days of the year. I take all year to make that, but that's neither here nor there. We pay the same amount of tax, and any dollars that he earns beyond that, once they go up into a higher tax bracket, the government takes a little bit more of that. So that's what's called a marginal tax rate. You got to understand marginal tax rate. So that's my presentation on those types of taxes. You can see here that a set per dollar tax, any fixed dollar amount is a regressive tax. So some of these have hidden regressive taxes, like the California state sales tax and the toll road tax. That's my time for today.